What's up, film fans? What does this...
You wouldn't dare. I'm the royal ward of King Richard, and no one but the king himself has the right to condemn me to death.
have to do with this?
You talking to me?
It's a tenuous connection, but one we'll start to explore as we look at the industry roots of the rise and fall of New Hollywood. Hey everybody, in this episode of The Rise and Fall of New Hollywood, I want to talk a little bit about some of the roots in the Hollywood system, the industrial, financial system, corporate and legal system that led to the rise of New Hollywood. As I said in the introductory video, if you've watched that, if you haven't, you can watch it here. None of this stuff happens overnight. It's the small accretion of events, of changes, financial changes, legal changes, production practice changes, and so on, that accumulate over time that bring about change. And this isn't just a Hollywood thing, this is an everything thing, right? The nature of a video series like this means I'll have to gloss over a lot of stuff, of course. So when I talk about a certain legal decision, which I will in a few minutes, just know that these legal decisions I'll mention are not the only ones that were happening. They're the kind of major ones we look at as turning points. If you want to know a little bit more about the classical studio system era of Hollywood, especially behind the scenes, you've probably all seen the movies, but behind the scenes, there's two books that I could recommend. There are a lot of books, but two I could recommend. The first one is this, David Bordwell, Kristen Thompson, and Janet Steiger, The Classical Hollywood Cinema, Film Style and Mode of Production to 1960. Now this is kind of an old book. It's also a thick jobby. And some of the arguments that they make have been challenged and recast by scholars in the wake of this book. But it's still a really great in-depth introduction to the production aspect of filmmaking, how films were made, how they were put together, who had the power in Hollywood and so on, in terms of the filmmaking itself. A slightly newer book that's also fascinating is The Hollywood Studio System, A History by Douglas Gomery. This is another behind the scenes look, but this one is more about the finances. Who controlled the studios? We often look at people like Jack Warner and Louis B. Mayer, but who was the puppet master behind those people? Who were the money people? And what's nice about both of these books is that they go into a lot more detail about some of the changes that I'm going to be talking about in this video. So if you watch some of the things I say and you're like, I want to find out more, there are lots of places you can turn to, but these two books are a really great start. They are academic and scholarly books, but they're both really highly readable. These are great writers and passionate film writers, so give them a look if you want to find out more. But even as we acknowledge that we're glossing over stuff, to understand how New Hollywood came about, we have to understand a little bit about classical Hollywood and the changes that were wrought upon classical Hollywood as it reached its peak and then started to decline. And I want to talk about something briefly called vertical integration, which some of you who are film students may have already heard of or may already be familiar with, but it's worth knowing a little bit more about. So cast your mind back to the early days of cinema, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and think about three things that had to exist for movies to be made and for people to see them. First, you had to have filmmakers with equipment and stories and performers to make the films. And this is what would become known as production. Someone writes a script, or back then, maybe just an outline, a treatment, a scenario, whatever we want to call it. Actors perform it, camera people shoot it, editors cut it, and then it's printed on film. And now you have a film. What are you going to do? Show it in your living room? You've got to get this film out to people. You have to make copies. Those films have to be delivered. If you're making films in Los Angeles, as American films increasingly were by the 1910s and early teens, you have to get them to the East Coast. If you're making them in New York, as the earliest films were, and films continue to be throughout the teens, you have to get them to California and everywhere in between, Chicago, Kansas City, Houston, and so on. And you have to let people know that there are films out there to watch. You have to publicize them. This aspect became known as distribution. And distribution would cover the delivery of the films and the publication of the film, advertising, publicity, and so on. Finally, though, you need a place to show those films where people can come, right? In the early days, you had the Nickelodeons, which were basically storefronts. You also had church halls. You had fairgrounds, and so on, wherever someone could put up a white sheet and project the film. And those slowly developed through the co-opting of music halls and other theaters into what we know today as the movie theater. And this is what we call exhibition. In the early days of Hollywood and in other national studios, those three things tend to be divided, and people kind of ran their aspect of one. So you had filmmakers making films, and then they would hook up with somebody who they hoped would help them get their film out there, and that person or company would get in touch with the church hall or the fairground or the Nickelodeon and make deals with them to show these films. And that's kind of how it worked for about up on 20 to 30 years. By the late teens in Hollywood and early 20s, the men who built what we call the studio system, people like Zukor, Fox, Laemmle, and others, had discovered that they could streamline this process. This was the time of growing mass production, of assembly line production, and things like that. And these men took this idea to a different level with filmmaking, and some of them came from exhibition, some of them came from distribution, and some of them came from production. But what they all started to realize was that if they owned all of those three components, they could streamline the process, but they could also increase both their control over the process and their profits from the process. And this is what became known as vertical integration. The studio ownership of production, distribution, and exhibition. Basically what that means is the studio makes the film, the studio pays a division of itself to distribute the film to cinemas that are owned, you guessed it, by the studio. Let's break each of these areas down a little bit further so it's clear the scope of what the studios owned and what they controlled during this classical era. By the early 1930s, once sound had arrived, the big studios in Hollywood controlled all the means of production. And these would be the big eight, which were Universal, United, Paramount, Columbia, Warner Brothers, Fox, MGM, and RKO. Those probably all sound familiar with you because 7 of those are still big production companies in Hollywood today, even though they're owned by bigger companies like Sony and Disney. RKO, if you're a watcher of older films, you've seen that radio tower. It was one of the big 8 as well. By owning the means of production, what you should understand is that they owned everything. They owned the studio lots. They owned the props. They owned the costumes. They owned the costume material. But not only that, not only did they own the materials, in a sense they owned the talent as well. And that was an important part of the success of classical Hollywood and an important part of its downfall. Classical era studios would have talent in front of the camera and behind the camera under contract. And you'll hear that term used a lot when you watch old movies about Hollywood. Even if you've seen Mank recently, there's a lot of talk about where Mank is under contract. And contracts tended to be based on a certain number of years, often 7 years. And Hollywood studios had an interesting way of counting those years. They weren't 7 calendar years, like January 1st, 2021 to December 31st, 2027. They counted the years based on when you were working. So if you went and made a film for 6 months, they didn't take that long back then, but let's just say that was 6 months off your contract. But if you then took a 3-month break between films, the studios considered you not to be working, so not fulfilling your contract. Now, that's a little dicey in and of itself, but if you relate that to another practice they had, which was to control in which films performers appeared or on which films crew members worked, they could decide when your 7 years were up. If you were a performer who was unhappy with a certain role and chose not to take it, the studio could say, fine, you're not getting another film, and you're sitting there with 5 years off your contract, 2 more to go, but you're not working in films because they won't put you in any, so you're not working off those 2 years. So they have you. This is what I mean by owned. And what they would often do is renegotiate the contracts, especially performers' contracts, before the 7 years were up. And if you as a performer did not want to renegotiate that contract, you wanted to leave Warner Brothers for the glamour of MGM or something like that, they'd say, no, you're staying with us. And you'd say, no, I want to go to MGM. And they'd say, fine, you're not working in any films, so you're not going to knock off those last 2 years. So you're stuck there. And the thing is, the studios all did this, and they all had a tacit, unwritten agreement that they wouldn't hire talent from in front of or behind the camera from other studios if that talent hadn't completed its contract. So, in effect, the studios owned these people. On occasion, you'll hear about studios trading talent. So sometimes a Warner Brothers performer might show up in an MGM or a Fox film and vice versa because they traded 2 actors or directors or whatever it might be. But generally, they owned your ass. The second phase of vertical integration is distribution, and that one's pretty clear. That's the very sort of physical process of getting the film duplicated and then, as it says, distributed. How do you get it out to the cinemas? And as I mentioned at the top, publicizing those films. So getting your performers, whom you kind of owned, to go on publicity tours, to go on radio, later, early on, to make television appearances, and so on, to publicize the films. And this is a very important part of the process because it's that often unseen middle segment between the making of the film and the showing of the film. And studios owned this as well. And the third part is exhibition. And this can seem simple, showing films. But remember that the studios often owned the cinemas, particularly the big 5. So Universal, United, and RKO generally didn't own any cinemas, but Columbia, Paramount, Fox, MGM, and Warner Brothers did. So they could dictate which films were shown in which cinemas when. Even if there were sort of quasi-franchise owners in the cities who ran the cinemas, they had very little choice about which films they wanted to show because the studios dictated it. And there were 2 practices, and I won't go into too much detail about these, that theater managers especially resented. And the first one is called block booking. And this is when a studio would take one of its highly in-demand films and send it to a cinema and say, yes, you can have this film, but you got to take these 3 or 4 films as well, and you have to show them. And the theater manager might say, but nobody's coming in and those films aren't making money. But the studios had a financial stake in getting those films out there. So you want to show this film? We own you. You show this film, you got to show these films as well. And this is called block booking. The second one, which is a little bit more complicated, is called the run, zone, clearance system. And that was basically that the studios would decide where a film would show, for how long it could be shown, when it would move somewhere else, and when that film could be shown at different theaters in the same zone. For example, some of the studios had several cinemas in New York City. They might choose to show Casablanca at one of those cinemas, and it could only show at that cinema for a certain length of time. That's the zone, right? And the length of time that it would show there would be the run. And once they'd milked as much as they could in that cinema out of Casablanca, they would take it out. That's the clearance. And then another cinema might be able to show it. And then other smaller cinemas might be able to rent it and show it as well. So when we talk about exhibition, and this is very important for what's to come, it's important to know that the studios controlled where films were showed, for how long they were shown, and where else they could be shown later during the second or third runs. This system gave the studio heads immense power. Now, there was money behind the studio heads. There were banks behind the studio heads, and Montgomery's book goes into this in great detail where the real power was. But the public-facing power of the studios were Jack Warner, Louis B. Mayer, and so on. And they controlled every aspect of the filmmaking, and they profited immensely. Not everybody liked this, including the United States federal government, who saw this as something of an oligopolical trust, right? It was anti-competitive. And from the late 20s, the US government was investigating how to break up vertical integration, how to break up these studios. And they came close to suing the studios in the 30s, but with the rise of the Second World War, there was a tacit agreement between the government and the studios that we're gonna leave you alone for a little while. You can keep making your profits from this vertical integration system, but you have to help us out by making pro-war films, whether it's the Why We Fight documentaries or to start making films like Casablanca that include pro-American, anti-Nazi sentiment. However, when the war ended, the government changed its tune. The other people, obviously, who weren't satisfied with this system were the talent, particularly performers. Performers often felt like they were typecast, like they had more to offer. They wanted to stretch their performance wings and fly, but the studios wouldn't let them. They'd say, no, Bette Davis, this is the role that we want you to play. Bette Davis would say, I don't want to. And Bette Davis did engage in extended and contentious contract negotiations, which she ultimately, at least earlier in her career, was unsuccessful in renegotiating. In the 1940s, two legal cases came about that seriously hampered studio control of their product that would eventually lead to the creation of conditions that would allow New Hollywood to flourish. The first of these was the 1944 California court decision that's come to be known as the De Havilland Law, otherwise known as Olivia De Havilland versus Warner Brothers. If you don't know Olivia De Havilland, she's a famous Oscar-winning actor from the classical era, perhaps best known for her role in Gone with the Wind, and who passed away last summer at the youthful age of 104. And she wanted to get out of her contract with Warner Brothers, and based on the things I've outlined earlier, they wouldn't let her. They used this 7-year contract situation to keep her bound to Warner Brothers, and she took them to court, and it took quite a long time to work its way through the courts, but eventually they decided in De Havilland's favor, and they didn't just decide in De Havilland's favor, they decided that that contractual setup was not legal, that it was against labor rights, that 7 years is 7 calendar years, 5 years is 5 calendar years. And this created an immense amount of freedom, because what it meant was at the end of a contract period, an actor was free to move from one company to another, to renegotiate their contract. It also meant that actors no longer had to agree to appear in every single film that a studio wanted them to appear in, because the studio couldn't hold that non-working period over their head, right? The actor could wait out the 7 years. They didn't like to do that, and they often appeared in films that they didn't want to appear in because they wanted to be working. They wanted to be in the public eye, and so on. But they could choose to wait it out, and sometimes that did happen. This gave actors more power. A lot of times, as in with many of the artistic industries, actors break in young, they're inexperienced, they don't know a lot about contracts and how they work, and they're just excited, I'm going to be in a Hollywood movie. And a lot of those actors remain B players or their career fades, but some of them become Olivia De Havilland, Bette Davis, Humphrey Bogart. They become big stars and they want to renegotiate their contract, or they want to have opportunities that their current studio is not giving them. And the De Havilland law gave them the power to do that. And in a couple minutes, I'll come back to what that meant for the Hollywood filmmaking system. But first I want to talk about the second legal case I mentioned, and that came a few years later in 1948. It's often known as the Paramount Decree or the Paramount Decrees, and it's actually the first in a series of court cases. In this case, the United States versus Paramount Pictures Incorporated. And this was a United States Supreme Court decision in which the US government argued that what we now call vertical integration was antitrust. That there was this oligopoly that the studios controlled, this small group, and that their control over production, distribution, and particularly in this case, exhibition, was anti-competitive. And again, the studios lost. And what they lost was the control of the exhibition end of vertical integration. Basically, they could no longer own cinemas. And along with not being able to own these cinemas, a couple other key points were determined in these cases. The main one being that studios could no longer partake in the practice of block booking. They couldn't force you to show their B movies or their knockoffs if you wanted to also show their big crowd-pleasing films. Theaters could decide which films they wanted to show. This had massive ramifications for theatrical exhibition. First of all, independent theaters started to rise up. And those independent theaters might not have been as big as the ones that were spun off the studios, but they began to exercise a certain kind of power. They could deal directly with small production companies. They didn't have to deal with studios. They didn't have to show only studio films, and I'll come back to that in a minute. In the second one, and this is a long and slow process, but independent theaters didn't have to follow the production code, or what's often known as the Hays Code. And the Hays Code, maybe I'll do another video on that, was basically the informal rules that Hollywood studios used to censor themselves. And it's the rules that said like, men and women were in separate beds, or you couldn't show blood, or the bad guys couldn't win, or you couldn't defame foreign countries, or you couldn't have mixed race romances and things like that. And the studios followed this production code so that the government or state bodies wouldn't censor them. But now that they couldn't control which films were in which theaters, smaller production companies could start to push at that code, and independent theaters could choose to show those films. There were two big fallouts from these court decisions that lead us to New Hollywood. One is the rise of the power of agents, and two is the rise in the power of independent or quasi-independent production companies. Talent agents had been around for a long time, going back to the 19th century, managing touring musicians and touring performers. And there were talent managers in Hollywood, at least we know as early as the 1920s. But as actors no longer had to be beholden to studio wishes in terms of their contracts, they started to look around for financial and legal-minded people who could get them better deals. And this is where agents came in. And the the power of the Hollywood agent grew slowly through the 40s, expanded in the 50s, and became quite immense in the 60s and the 70s. And it wasn't just the individual agents, it was also talent agencies. One that we'll talk about a lot is MCA, which started as a music agency in Chicago in the 20s and moved to California in the 40s and expanded its talent to covering Hollywood performers and became an immense power broker in Hollywood, as led by a guy named Lew Wasserman, who film students will have heard of, but is one of the sort of key power players in the middle 50 years of the 20th century in Hollywood. What agents could do was negotiate not just year-long, 2 years, 5 years, 7 years contracts for their performers, but picture-by-picture deals. So now studios had to deal with agents, people who understood money, people who understood the law, if they wanted to get to the performer. And they had to deal with agents who were working in the best interest of their clients to get their clients more power and more money. And what this leads to is what Bordwell and Thompson call a shift from the producer unit system to the package unit system. Now this is something that again has been contested a little bit, but it makes a lot of sense. And basically what it means is under the producer unit system, a producer, the studio head or one of the studio head's kind of acolytes, put together the whole film. The producer decided everything. You're gonna write it, you're gonna shoot it, you're gonna star in it, we're gonna film it on the lot, we're gonna film it on location, you're gonna do costumes and so on. And the producer did that all. The package unit system, what they describe as the package unit system, is where agents and small production companies come up with an idea for the package. We want this kind of film, and we want this kind of writer, and we want this kind of star, and then they can go out and look for that talent individually and bring talent together for each package, each film, rather than having a stable of talent that they can draw on at will. And that's going to lead directly to films like Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, Easy Rider, and so on. The second big change or big shift was the rise in power of independent production companies. There had always been independent production companies in Hollywood. Oftentimes they were referred to in the sort of 30s to the 50s as Poverty Row studios, places like Monogram and Republic. And these studios oftentimes put out great films. A lot of John Wayne's early westerns are Poverty Row studios. A lot of the great film noir are Poverty Row studios. But they had to enter into complicated distribution deals with the majors, complicated exhibition deals with the majors to get their films out there. But once you remove Hollywood studios from exhibition, now these production companies are free to deal directly with the theaters. And not only could they deal directly with the theaters in terms of getting their content into those cinemas, but they could deal directly with them in terms of new patterns of exhibition. So in the olden days, under the run zone clearance system, studios would often release films in New York and Los Angeles. And they would wait until they milked those markets, and then they would spread up and down the coasts, up towards San Francisco, down towards Boston, and then inward towards Chicago and St. Louis and Houston and so on. But they decided when and where the films would be shown. Now that the theaters could decide this themselves, they could work with production companies to have slightly wider releases, to show just one film, for example, instead of several films. All kinds of different release and exhibition patterns were experimented with throughout the 50s and 60s until we get to the 70s, when we have a complete and total change in how films are being distributed and exhibited. And the studios got their ideas for a lot of the 70s exhibition patterns from what these independent production companies and independent theaters were doing in the 50s and 60s. Like I've said, and I'll continue to say throughout, this was a slow process. It didn't just happen in 1948. Ooh, the Paramount Decree has been decided. Bling! These independent production companies come up and deal with the independent theaters that are there and start making deals outside of the system. It took time. But the result was that you have a system in place from the 30s through the early 50s where the studios own everything, to a system where they lose their theaters, so they lose the power of exhibition, of controlling exhibition, and eventually, as the smaller production companies come in, they start to lose some of their power of production. They remain key players, and they still do today, remain key players in distribution, right? And that's why you would see like the Mirish Corporation, which I talk about in my In the Heat of the Night video, working with United. The Mirish Corporation would produce films in the 60s and into the 70s, and then work with United to distribute them. So by the time of the late 60s, this system, this vertical integration system, which had cemented studio power for several decades, was disintegrating. And that, combined with some other developments, particularly the aging of the studio heads and the purchasing of studios by large corporations, created a new body of filmmaking thinking, of filmmaking talent, of distribution ideas, of exhibition ideas that was necessary to allow the films and the filmmaking practices of New Hollywood to flourish. That's all for now. In the next video, we'll look at some of the generational shifts amongst the filmmakers and how they were influenced by Europe, Japan, and events that were happening in the country around them to become the movie brats. Until then, my name's Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.